In the pre-dawn darkness of June 19, 1944, something extraordinary was about to unfold across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, though the men preparing for what lay ahead could scarcely imagine the magnitude of what history would remember as one of the most lopsided aerial engagements ever witnessed in modern warfare. The waters of the Philippine Sea stretched endlessly in every direction, black as ink beneath a sky still clinging to night's final moments, and across this darkness, two massive naval forces were converging on a collision course that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Pacific theatre of World War II. The Japanese Imperial Navy, once the undisputed master of these waters, was about to launch what it believed would be a decisive blow against the American fleet, sending wave after wave of aircraft into the sky with orders to destroy the enemy carriers and restore Japan's supremacy over the Pacific. What actually happened instead would become a catastrophe of such epic proportions that American pilots, watching enemy planes tumble from the sky in unprecedented numbers, would compare the day's events to shooting turkeys on a farm, a grim piece of gallows humour that would forever attach itself to this battle and ensure that it would be remembered, at least among those who fought there, as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Americans had positioned themselves with calculated precision, their massive Task Force 58 representing the most powerful concentration of naval aviation ever assembled up to that point in human history, a floating armada of destruction that included no fewer than 15 fast aircraft carriers, 7 battleships gleaming with fresh paint and bristling with anti-aircraft guns, 8 heavy cruisers whose massive guns could hurl shells the weight of automobiles across dozens of miles of ocean, and a protective screen of destroyers and support vessels that turned the formation into a moving fortress of steel and determination. From the decks of these carriers, nearly 1,000 aircraft could be launched, a staggering number that represented not just American industrial might, but also a fundamental shift in how wars would be fought in the modern age. The task force was commanded by Admiral Raymond Spruance, a calculating and methodical officer whose cautious nature had earned him both criticism and respect, while the immediate tactical control of the carrier forces rested in the capable hands of Rear Admiral Mark Mitcher, a former aviator himself who understood intimately what his pilots would face in the sky above. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of this American force was not visible to the naked eye at all. Deep within the steel hulls of the American carriers, in darkened rooms illuminated only by the eerie green glow of radar screens, teams of specialists were manning what they called combat information centers, technological marvels that allowed the Americans to peer far beyond the horizon and detect incoming enemy aircraft long before those aircraft could pose any threat to the fleet. This radar technology, still relatively new and constantly being refined, gave the Americans an almost godlike awareness of the battle space around them, allowing controllers to vector intercepting fighters with precision that would have seemed like science fiction just a few years earlier. When enemy formations appeared on those glowing screens, the American response could be measured and methodical rather than panicked and chaotic, with fighters being launched in calculated waves, positioned at optimal altitudes, and guided directly toward their targets with radio instructions that turned aerial combat from a confused melee into something approaching orchestrated precision. The aircraft that would bear the brunt of the fighting on the American side was the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, a fighter plane that had been specifically designed to counter the strengths and exploit the weaknesses of Japan's premier fighter, the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0. Throughout the early years of the Pacific War, the Zero had terrorized Allied pilots with its extraordinary maneuverability and climbing ability, turning and twisting through the sky with a grace that heavier American fighters simply could not match. The Zero's designers had achieved this performance through a philosophy of extreme weight reduction, stripping away every ounce of unnecessary mass, which meant that the aircraft carried no armor plating to protect its pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks that could survive bullet strikes without bursting into flames, and a lightweight structure that was vulnerable to even relatively minor battle damage. In the hands of a skilled and experienced pilot, these compromises had been acceptable, even brilliant, allowing Zero pilots to dominate the skies over Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and countless other battlefields across the Pacific. But as the war ground on and Japan's pool of veteran aviators steadily diminished through attrition, these design compromises became fatal flaws, and the arrival of the Hellcat transformed those flaws into death sentences. The Hellcat represented an entirely different philosophy of fighter design, one that prioritized survivability and firepower over agility and elegance. Powered by a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine that generated 2,000 horsepower. The Hellcat was heavier than the Zero, less maneuverable in traditional dogfighting terms, but possessed advantages that more than compensated for any lack of grace. It could dive faster, climb higher, and most importantly, it brought its pilots home alive. Behind every Hellcat pilot's seat sat a thick plate of armor that could stop bullets and shell fragments that would have killed a Zero pilot instantly. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, meaning that even when punctured by enemy fire, they would automatically close around the holes and prevent the catastrophic fires that had killed so many Japanese pilots. And mounted in the wings were 6 50-caliber machine guns, each capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute, creating a combined stream of fire so devastating that even a brief burst could tear an enemy aircraft to pieces. American pilots quickly learned to exploit these advantages through a tactic they called boom and zoom, diving from superior altitude to make a high-speed attack run, firing their guns in a quick, devastating burst, then using their superior power to climb back to safety before the more maneuverable but slower climbing Zeros could respond. Behind the American military machine stood another advantage that was perhaps even more decisive than technology, though less dramatic and therefore less celebrated in popular accounts of the war. America's industrial capacity, once fully mobilized for war production, was simply overwhelming in its scale and efficiency. While Japanese factories struggled to produce a few dozen replacement aircraft each month, working with limited raw materials and increasingly disrupted supply chains, American assembly lines were churning out fighters, bombers, and other aircraft by the thousands, a relentless tide of aluminum and steel that flowed across the Pacific in numbers that Japanese planners had never imagined possible. For every Zero destroyed, Japan found it increasingly difficult to produce a replacement, and even when replacement aircraft could be manufactured, finding pilots to fly them became an insurmountable challenge. The Japanese training program, once rigorous and extensive, had been abbreviated out of desperate necessity, with new pilots being rushed through abbreviated courses that left them with perhaps 50 hours of flight time, maybe less, before being thrown into combat against American pilots who typically arrived at their squadrons with 300 hours or more of training behind them. This disparity in training created a vicious cycle that Japan could not escape. Inexperienced pilots died quickly in combat, which meant that even fewer experienced pilots were available to train the next generation, which meant that each subsequent wave of replacements was even less prepared than the one before, spiraling downward toward inevitable collapse. By the middle of 1944, some Japanese officers were privately describing their pilot training program as a system for creating victims rather than warriors, sending boys who could barely keep their aircraft straight and level into combat against enemy pilots who had been hardened by months or years of actual combat experience and were flying superior aircraft backed by superior logistics and tactical coordination. The Japanese force approaching Task Force 58 on that June morning in 1944 consisted of approximately 400 aircraft in the first assault waves, launched from carriers commanded by Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, a competent officer who found himself trapped by circumstances beyond his control and strategic assumptions that were no longer valid. Ozawa's plan relied on several assumptions that seemed reasonable on paper, but would prove catastrophically wrong in execution. First, he believed that his aircraft could strike the American carriers from beyond the range at which American aircraft could effectively retaliate, giving his forces the initiative and the element of surprise. Second, he counted on land-based aircraft from fields on Guam and other Mariana Islands to supplement his carrier planes and overwhelm the American defenses through sheer numbers. Third, and perhaps most fatally, he appears to have underestimated just how thoroughly the balance of air power had shifted in favor of the Americans, still thinking in terms of the early war period when Japanese aircraft and pilots had dominated every engagement. None of these assumptions would survive contact with reality. The American radar operators detected the incoming Japanese formations while they were still well over 100 miles away, watching the ominous blips multiply on their screens as wave after wave of enemy aircraft headed toward the task force. In earlier battles, this would have triggered something close to panic, a desperate scramble to get fighters airborne and positioned before the enemy arrived, with confusion and chaos degrading the defensive effort. But on this morning, the American response was calm, measured, and devastatingly effective. Fighter directors studying the radar returns calculated the enemy's speed, altitude, and bearing, then began vectoring Hellcat squadrons into optimal intercept positions with radio commands that left nothing to chance. Launch crews on the carrier decks worked with practiced efficiency, sending fighter after fighter roaring down the flight decks and into the lightening sky, each pilot knowing his assigned altitude and patrol station, each squadron fitting into a carefully orchestrated defensive plan that left no gaps for the enemy to exploit. The first American fighters made contact with the first Japanese formation somewhere around 75 miles from the task force, and what followed was less a battle than an execution. The Japanese pilots, many of them inexperienced and poorly trained, found themselves facing opponents who knew exactly where they were, exactly what altitude they were at, and exactly how to exploit every weakness in their formations and their aircraft. The Hellcats came diving out of the sun, a classic attack position that blinded the defenders and gave the attackers every possible advantage, and the 650 caliber guns in each American fighter tore through the lightweight Zero frames with devastating effect. A single 2-second burst could be enough to shred control surfaces, punch through the unprotected fuel tanks, or kill the pilot in his unarmored cockpit. The morning sky began to fill with falling aircraft trailing smoke and flame, spinning down toward the ocean far below, while their pilots, if they were still alive, fought desperately with useless controls or simply waited for the impact that would end everything. Some Japanese pilots did manage to fight back with skill and determination, particularly those few veterans who still remembered how to maximize the Zero's remaining advantages, but they were far too few and their efforts were ultimately futile against the overwhelming numbers and superior coordination of the American defense. When a Zero did manage to get on a Hellcat's tail and open fire, the American pilot could often simply dive away, using his aircraft's superior speed and structural strength to escape from a situation that would have been fatal in a Wildcat or other earlier American fighter. And even when Japanese bullets did find their mark, the Hellcat's armor and self-sealing tanks meant that damage that would have destroyed a Zero often resulted in nothing more than a few holes in the wings and a pilot who returned safely to his carrier with an exciting story to tell and perhaps a few new grey hairs. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft were intercepted and destroyed before they could even sight the American carriers, with each successive formation being met by fresh Hellcat squadrons that had been launched while the previous defensive wave was still engaged with the enemy. The American system worked with mechanical precision, creating a rotating barrier of fighters that meant the Japanese were always facing fresh, fully armed opponents while their own pilots grew increasingly exhausted and depleted. Some Japanese formations became so disrupted by the American attacks that they essentially disintegrated as organized units, with individual aircraft scattering across the sky, some trying to press on toward their targets alone, others attempting to flee back toward their own carriers, all of them being systematically hunted down and destroyed by American pilots who had been trained to show no mercy and felt none. Those few Japanese aircraft that did manage to fight their way through the American fighter screen found themselves facing a wall of anti-aircraft fire that was almost as devastating as the Hellcats had been. The American ships had been expecting this moment, their gunners trained and ready, their weapons systems ranging from massive 5-inch guns that could throw up explosive shells that burst into clouds of shrapnel to smaller automatic weapons that could fill the sky with streams of tracers. The few Japanese pilots who attempted to press their attacks through this maelstrom of steel and explosives were committing suicide, and most of them never had a chance to line up a proper bombing run before their aircraft were torn apart or set ablaze. By some accounts, not a single Japanese aircraft managed to inflict significant damage on any American carrier during the entire first day of the battle, a testament to the effectiveness of the American defensive system and the hopelessness of the Japanese position. As the morning wore into afternoon, the scope of the disaster became increasingly apparent to both sides. American pilots returned to their carriers with stories of enemy aircraft falling from the sky like rain, describing kill after kill with an almost casual tone that spoke to how one-sided the combat had been. Some pilots expended all their ammunition and returned to rearm, only to launch again and shoot down more Japanese aircraft on their second or even third sorties of the day. The radio circuits were filled with excited voices calling out targets, claiming kills, warning each other about threats, and increasingly expressing amazement at the sheer number of enemy aircraft they were destroying. Someone, nobody seems quite certain who, coined the phrase that would define the battle, comparing the day's hunting to shooting turkeys, those ungainly domestic birds that American farm boys would hunt back home, easy targets that lacked the intelligence or ability to evade a determined hunter. For the Japanese pilots who survived long enough to turn back toward their carriers, assuming they could even find their carriers after the confusion and chaos of combat, the return flight must have been filled with horror and despair. They had been told that Japanese pilots were superior, that Japanese aircraft were the finest in the world, that spirit and determination could overcome any material disadvantage. They had been taught that death in service to the emperor was the highest honor a warrior could achieve, but nothing in their training had prepared them for the reality of being utterly outclassed, of watching their comrades die in numbers that seemed impossible, of facing an enemy who killed with clinical efficiency and showed no sign of the uncertainty or fear that might give hope of survival or victory. Admiral Ozawa, monitoring reports from his diminishing air groups, found himself in an impossible situation. He had committed his forces to a battle plan that assumed Japanese numerical and qualitative superiority, or at least parity, but the reality was that his aircraft were being slaughtered wholesale while inflicting virtually no damage in return. He could not withdraw without abandoning whatever aircraft were still in the air, but continuing the attack was simply feeding more pilots and planes into a meat grinder that was destroying Japan's naval air power with each passing hour. The decision of whether to continue or retreat was made even more difficult by the fragmentary and often misleading reports he was receiving, with some pilots claiming successful attacks on American carriers that had never actually occurred, either through honest mistakes in the confusion of combat or through a desire to report some success, however fictional, to justify their survival. By the end of the first day of fighting, the Japanese had launched approximately 400 aircraft in multiple waves, and of these, nearly 300 failed to return. Some had been shot down by Hellcats, others had been destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, still others had been so badly damaged that they ditched in the ocean or crashed attempting to land on their carriers. The American losses for the same period totaled less than 30 aircraft, and many of those were operational losses rather than combat casualties, planes that had mechanical failures or ran out of fuel rather than being shot down by the enemy. The kill ratio was approximately 10-1 in favor of the Americans, a disparity so extreme that some historians have questioned whether the Japanese pilots were even adequately trained to fight at all, though this seems unfair to the individual pilots who were simply victims of a system that had failed them catastrophically. But the destruction of Japanese aircraft, as devastating as it was not even the most strategically significant aspect of the battle. What made the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot truly decisive was the fact that Japan could not replace what it had lost. Every experienced pilot killed over the Philippine Sea represented years of training and combat experience that was simply gone forever, irreplaceable knowledge and skill that died with the man. Every zero shot down represented manufacturing capacity and raw materials that Japan could barely afford to expend and could not quickly replace. The Americans, by contrast, had the industrial capacity to replace their relatively light losses within days or weeks, and their pilot training pipeline was producing hundreds of new aviators every month, each one better trained than his predecessor as the training programs refined their methods based on combat experience. The second day of the battle saw Admiral Mitscher take the offensive, launching American strikes against the Japanese carriers and supporting vessels that were attempting to withdraw from the area. These strikes inflicted further heavy losses on the Japanese, sinking several carriers and destroying additional aircraft, though at a higher cost to the Americans since they were now operating at extreme range, and several aircraft ran out of fuel during the return flight, forcing their pilots to ditch in the ocean where rescue was uncertain. Nevertheless, the American strikes effectively crippled what remained of Ozawa's force and ensured that the Japanese Navy's carrier-based aviation capability would never recover to anything approaching its earlier strength. In the aftermath of the battle, both sides had to confront the implications of what had occurred. For the Americans, the Battle of the Philippine Sea confirmed that they had achieved air superiority over the Pacific and that Japanese carrier forces were no longer a significant threat to American operations in the region. This realization allowed American planners to operate with much greater confidence and aggression in subsequent campaigns, knowing that the Japanese simply lacked the air power to seriously threaten major American fleet operations. The capture of the Mariana Islands proceeded according to plan, giving the Americans bases from which B-29 Superfortress bombers could reach the Japanese home islands, beginning the strategic bombing campaign that would devastate Japanese cities and industrial capacity over the coming months. For Japan, the implications were far more grim. The loss of so many trained pilots and aircraft in a single engagement meant that the Japanese Navy would never again be able to conduct large-scale carrier operations effectively. The few carriers that survived the Philippine Sea battle would spend the rest of the war either in port or serving as decoy targets, lacking sufficient trained pilots and aircraft to make them effective fighting vessels. The Japanese military would increasingly turn to desperate measures, including the organized suicide attacks known as kamikaze strikes, which represented not a strength but a final admission that conventional tactics were no longer viable, given Japan's depleted resources and collapsing training infrastructure. The technological and tactical lessons of the Philippine Sea were studied carefully by both sides and influenced the remainder of the Pacific War. The Americans refined their carrier task force procedures even further, improving their radar coverage and fighter direction capabilities, enhancing their anti-aircraft defenses, and continually updating their aircraft to maintain their technological edge. The Hellcat continued to dominate Japanese opposition whenever it was encountered, racking up a final war record of over 5,000 enemy aircraft destroyed with a kill ratio of 19-1, numbers that speak to both the excellence of the aircraft itself and the system of training, logistics, and tactical doctrine that supported it. The individual stories of pilots who fought in the battle add human dimension to the statistics and strategic analysis. American pilots who had entered the war flying obsolete aircraft against a superior enemy now found themselves in the opposite position, flying superior aircraft against an enemy that was increasingly helpless. Some felt a measure of grim satisfaction at this reversal of fortunes, remembering comrades who had died in the early days of the war when American equipment and tactics were inadequate. Others felt something closer to pity for the Japanese pilots they were killing so easily, recognizing that many of them were young men who had been sent into an impossible situation through no fault of their own. A few American pilots who had shot down multiple enemy aircraft in a single sortie reported feeling physically sick afterward, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the slaughter they had participated in, finding no glory in killing opponents who had posed so little threat. For the surviving Japanese pilots, those few who made it back to their carriers or managed to reach bases in the Marianas before those islands fell to American forces, the psychological impact of the defeat was profound and lasting. They had been raised in a military culture that emphasized warrior spirit and the superiority of Japanese fighting men, taught that determination and sacrifice could overcome any material advantage the enemy might possess. The Battle of the Philippine Sea shattered these comfortable myths, forcing them to confront the reality that they were flying inferior aircraft, receiving inadequate training, and fighting an enemy that had surpassed them in every measurable category. Some Japanese aviators who survived the battle never flew again, psychologically broken by the experience. Others continued to fight with increasing desperation as the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion, knowing that survival was increasingly unlikely, but finding meaning in the act of resistance itself, even when victory was no longer conceivable. The strategic implications of American air superiority extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation in the Pacific. With the Mariana Islands secured and Japanese naval aviation effectively destroyed, American submarines and surface forces could operate with much greater freedom, interdicting Japanese shipping lanes and slowly strangling Japan's ability to import the raw materials necessary to continue fighting. The strategic bombing campaign launched from the Marianas brought the reality of total war directly to the Japanese home islands, destroying factories, burning cities, and killing hundreds of thousands of civilians in raids that faced diminishing opposition as Japan's defensive fighter forces were ground down through attrition. The American advance across the Pacific accelerated, with major operations being launched against the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, each campaign bringing American forces closer to Japan itself and tightening the noose around a nation that could no longer defend itself effectively. The Zero, once feared across the Pacific as an almost supernatural opponent, became a symbol of Japan's faded glory, still occasionally dangerous when flown by the handful of surviving expert pilots, but increasingly irrelevant as American numerical and technological superiority made the outcome of any air battle a foregone conclusion. Japanese engineers designed improved versions of the Zero and developed new fighter aircraft that were potentially more competitive with American designs, but these improvements came too late and in too small numbers to change the fundamental balance of power. The Hellcat and its successors, including the even more powerful F-4U Corsair, ruled the Pacific skies for the remainder of the war, enabling American operations that would have been unthinkable in the early days of the conflict, when every carrier operation involved significant risk of crippling losses. The Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated conclusively that modern warfare had become as much about logistics, training, and industrial capacity as about courage and tactical skill, though these traditional military virtues remained important. A nation could not will itself to victory through determination alone, not when facing an opponent that could produce aircraft faster than they could be destroyed, train pilots more effectively than they could be killed, and coordinate complex military operations with technological systems that provided almost omniscient awareness of the battlefield. The romantic notions of aerial combat as individual duels between skilled warriors were swept away by the reality of mass production warfare, where victory went to the side that could sustain losses, replace equipment, and maintain a steady flow of adequately trained personnel to operate increasingly complex weapons systems. In the broader narrative of World War II in the Pacific, the Battle of the Philippine Sea represents the moment when Japan's defeat became not merely probable but essentially inevitable. Earlier battles like Midway had halted Japanese expansion and put Japan on the defensive, but the Philippine Sea broke Japan's ability to seriously threaten American offensive operations, removing the last major obstacle to the American advance toward the Japanese home islands. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 would provide the final shock that brought the war to its conclusion, but the path to those bombs being deliverable was paved in large part by the victories achieved in battles like the Philippine Sea, which destroyed Japan's ability to defend its airspace and left it vulnerable to attack from the strategic bombers operating from the Marianas. Looking back across the decades since the battle, historians have debated various aspects of the engagement and its significance. Some have criticized Admiral Spruance for being overly cautious in his approach, suggesting that a more aggressive American strategy might have resulted in the complete destruction of the Japanese carrier force rather than merely crippling it. Others have defended Spruance's decisions as appropriately prioritizing the safety of American forces and the success of the Marianas invasion over the pursuit of enemy forces that were already effectively defeated. Japanese historians and military analysts have examined how their forces came to be so thoroughly outmatched, with various explanations focusing on different aspects of Japan's strategic mistakes, industrial inadequacies, and tactical failures. Some have argued that Japan should never have engaged the American fleet under such unfavorable conditions, while others suggest that by mid-1944, Japan had no good options remaining and that defeat in the Philippine Sea was simply the inevitable result of earlier strategic mistakes that had left Japan in an untenable position. The human cost of the battle, while relatively light compared to some other engagements of World War II, was nonetheless significant, particularly for the Japanese side. Hundreds of young men who had climbed into their aircraft on the morning of June 19th never saw another dawn, dying in explosions of fuel and ammunition, burning alive in their cockpits, drowning in the ocean after being shot down, or suffering any of the other countless horrible deaths that awaited pilots in combat. Each of these deaths represented not just a statistical casualty, but a unique individual with hopes, fears, families, and futures that were extinguished in moments of violence and terror. Even on the American side, where losses were much lighter, there were men who did not return, pilots who died in accidents or mechanical failures, sailors killed by the few Japanese attacks that did reach the fleet, and others who suffered wounds or psychological trauma that would haunt them long after the war ended. The veterans of the battle on both sides carried their memories of those June days for the rest of their lives, though many found it difficult to speak about their experiences, particularly as the years passed and the world moved on to other concerns. American veterans sometimes struggled with the memory of killing so many opponents who had posed so little threat, finding it difficult to feel pride in what felt more like slaughter than combat. Japanese veterans faced the different but equally difficult challenge of having survived a catastrophic defeat, living with the knowledge that so many of their comrades had died while they had lived, and trying to find meaning in a battle that seemed to represent nothing but futility and waste. In the small towns and rural areas where many of these veterans eventually settled after the war, their experiences in the Battle of the Philippine Islands Sea became part of local legend, stories told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy as the years turned into decades. Some veterans eventually wrote memoirs or gave interviews to historians, trying to capture something of what the battle had been like before the generation that had fought it passed entirely from living memory. Others took their stories to their graves, never speaking of what they had seen and done during those long hours of combat over the Philippine Sea, leaving historians to piece together the story from official records and the accounts of those who were willing to talk. The aircraft themselves, the Hellcats and Zeros that had fought in the battle, mostly ended their lives in much less dramatic fashion than the violence of combat. Many American Hellcats were eventually scrapped after the war as the military downsized and newer aircraft types made them obsolete, though some survived in various roles for years afterward, and a few were even preserved in museums where they can still be seen today, silent testimony to the industrial might and technological sophistication that won the Pacific War. The Zeros that survived the Battle of the Philippine Sea flew on through the remainder of the war, becoming increasingly rare as attrition continued to deplete Japanese air strength, until finally the last flyable examples were either destroyed in combat, abandoned when their bases were overrun, or surrendered to Allied forces after Japan's capitulation in August 1945. The strategic bombing campaign launched from the Marianas, made possible by the air superiority established at battles like the Philippine Sea, would ultimately kill more people than all the aerial combat engagements of the Pacific War combined, a grim reminder that the true horror of modern warfare often lies not in dramatic battles between military forces, but in the systematic destruction of enemy cities and industries that characterizes total war. The B-29 bombers that roared off runways on Tinian and Saipan, escorted by Hellcats and other fighters that had little to fear from the diminished Japanese air defenses, dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of incendiary and high-explosive bombs on Japanese cities, creating firestorms that killed civilians by the hundreds of thousands and left vast areas of urban Japan as smoking rubble. The moral implications of this strategic bombing campaign remain controversial even today, with debates about whether the destruction was militarily necessary or whether it represented a descent into barbarity that compromised the moral standing of the Allied cause. The development of radar technology and centralized fighter direction systems that proved so decisive in the Battle of the Philippine Sea would influence post-war military thinking and lead to even more sophisticated command and control systems in subsequent decades, eventually evolving into the computerized battle management systems that characterize modern warfare. The basic principle established in 1944, that technological awareness of the battlefield provides decisive advantages to those who possess it, has only become more important as sensor technology has advanced and information processing capabilities have expanded. Modern air defense systems can track hundreds of targets simultaneously and coordinate responses across vast distances, capabilities that would have seemed like magic to the fighter directors watching their radar screens aboard American carriers in June 1944, but which represent the logical evolution of the systems that proved their worth over the Philippine Sea. The lessons about training and pilot quality that emerged from the Battle of the Philippine Sea have influenced military aviation programs ever since, with most modern air forces recognizing that a smaller number of highly trained pilots in good aircraft will usually defeat a larger number of poorly trained pilots in inferior aircraft. The American emphasis on thorough training and adequate preparation, which took longer and consumed more resources in the short term but produced more capable pilots in the long term, has become the standard model for professional air forces around the world. The Japanese experience of rushing inadequately trained pilots into combat, which seemed necessary in the desperate circumstances of mid-1944 but resulted in catastrophic losses, serves as a cautionary example of how short-term thinking can lead to strategic disaster. And so the Battle of the Philippine Sea takes its place in history as one of the most decisive engagements of World War II, not because it involved the most forces or produced the most casualties, but because it marked the point at which Japan's ability to contest American control of the Pacific was irretrievably broken. The turkey shoot comparison, as dark and somewhat tasteless as it might seem, accurately captured something essential about the battle: the utter one-sidedness of an engagement in which one side possessed every advantage and the other side was essentially helpless despite the courage and determination of individual pilots. That such a disparity could exist between forces that had been relatively evenly matched just a few years earlier speaks to the dynamic nature of modern warfare, where technological advancement and industrial production can shift balances of power with remarkable speed. For those who lived through those days, whether as participants in the battle or as civilians following news of the war from half a world away, the Battle of the Philippine Sea represented both triumph and tragedy, a victory that brought the end of the war measurably closer, but also a demonstration of warfare's increasingly mechanized and impersonal nature. The age of the lone fighter pilot pitting his skill and courage against a worthy opponent in single combat was passing, replaced by an era of mass-production warfare in which individual heroism mattered less than systemic advantages in training, technology, and logistics. This transformation had been building throughout the war, but it crystallized in the skies over the Philippine Sea on those June days in 1944 when the myth of Japanese invincibility was destroyed and American air power established its complete dominance over the Pacific. The pilots who fought there on both sides of the battle were witnesses to and participants in this transformation, and their experiences offer insight into both the horror and the necessity of the conflict that consumed so many lives and changed the world forever.